Well, I'm really excited to be here. My name is Ken Bedell, and I am a senior advisor in the Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships at the U.S. Department of Education in the U.S. government. I don't know how long I could possibly make that, but this is really fun to be here with the Rumi Forum that has I was going to say a long history, but a history of just helping to raise issues. I don't know how many times I've sat in one of the chairs there and found myself both challenged and inspired. And so it's really fun to be here to play this role and to be here with Rebecca Winthrop, who is a senior fellow and director of the Center for Universal Education at Brookings, and a leading voice on education issues in the developing world. She's the former head of education for the International Rescue Committee and spent more than 20 years advising international institutions. And in conversation with her, I learned that international institutions means the NGOs and governments, and then people who are investing internationally, foreign aid organizations, and then in general, senior policymakers. And she has field experience of working in Asia, Africa, America, Latin America. Her work has and now focuses on girls' education, learning opportunities for the world's most marginalized children, and innovative education models. Our program is going to be, we're going to ask Rebecca to just share some things, and we're both carrying her book, and she will share a little bit. I get to ask the first question, and then we'll go into a general discussion, and so you'll be listening with the things that you'd like to hear from her with a little more depth. We'll have plenty of time to do that. So,
great. Good. Thanks so much, Ken, and thanks, Rumi, for having me, and to all of you for your interest in the topic. As Ken said, as he waved around, I'll be talking about a recent book I've done with my colleague Jean Sperling and Christina Kwok. It's called What Works in Girls' Education: Evidence for the World's Best Investment. And we came up with the subtitle after we'd gone through about 4 decades worth of evidence around girls' education and what impact does it have in the world. And we really felt like, wow, this is incredible. It is one of the sort of policy interventions, or one of the solutions in the world. There aren't that many where you can both help improve girls' lives through education and have knock-on effects on many, many, many different sectors. So when we say world's best investment, it's largely because improving girls' education has benefits across the board, from health to the economy, to reducing child marriage, to women's empowerment, etc. So I'm going to walk you through sort of the data that we found, why we really wrote the book, and then the other piece, which is the what works part, which is, what are the solutions out there that seem to have good evidence behind them, and then we can open it up for questions. So when we were sort of doing this research, we spent a lot of time trying to understand the data around girls' education. And for any of you who've done research projects, we had big maps up on the wall with little sticky notes, clustering them all over the place, trying to figure out what are the right categories, which belongs to which. And at the end of the day, we decided, really what we had was a top 10 list. We had sort of 10 major reasons why girls' education is really the world's best investment. And I have them here. Everyone, every once in a while, asks me to recite them from memory, and I always forget one, so embarrassingly. So I'll read them out for you, and I'll give you a little bit of a flavor. So one of the ones that probably you've heard a lot about is the economic growth argument. So investing in girls' education promotes economic growth. That's true for girls and boys, by the way. It's particularly true if you have high quality learning outcomes, you get good growth. But it's certainly, particularly for girls, because women are not in the labor market as much as men globally around the world, it adds a whole nother level of population into the labor market and productivity, et cetera. So that's the economic growth argument. And the second one is that it improves wages, women's wages and jobs. There's a lot of evidence around women being in vulnerable employment or very underemployed or in the informal labor market or not in the labor market at all. And of course, as you would expect, the more education girls and hence young women get, and women later in their lives, they just have a much better chance of having a better job. They have higher wages, more stability for their family. The third is that it really saves lives. And it saves lives in many different ways. For example, the higher education levels of women has been really attributed to a reduction in their own mortality when they give birth, so maternal mortality. There's been really powerful evidence coming out of some of the health journals around reducing infant mortality, and this is one of the statistics I love because it's been a very rigorous study that showed half the decrease in infant mortality since 1970 has been due to better educated mothers, which is huge. Half the decrease of infant mortality is girls' education. Not that, you still need to do health interventions, that's equally important, but what we're learning is that girls' education is almost equally effective in some cases as addressing sort of issues of infant and maternal mortality. The fourth one is that it leads to healthier and smaller families. We toyed around with the word of saying more sustainable families. This is also very clear that as young women, girls and young women get increasing levels of education, they have much fewer children, like half the number. And that just makes for usually much healthier kids. It makes for sort of more prosperous family. It depends on the context. But that's an important piece, and it's an important piece that we're learning more and more in relation to climate change, actually, if you think about it. This is something that my colleague Homi Karas and I at Brookings have been talking about, and he's been writing some on, and we've done some joint pieces. If you think about sort of one of the biggest things you can do to mitigate climate change in the world, it probably is to reduce how many people are projected to be on the planet. So at the moment there's two different, I'm going like this because this is how the charts are trending. We have about 7 billion people on the planet today. There's different projections, and it depends all on the level of girls' education. One is projected that there'll be 9 billion people in the future, another is that there'll be 11 billion people, and the difference in those projections are if every girl is going to get a high school education. And if they do, the projection is the population will not grow by that extra 2 billion people. And certainly if you're looking at climate change, you should and could do lots of things around addressing climate change, and we could all go green, et cetera, but one of the biggest impacts to reduce climate change is to make sure we do stay from 11 billion to 9 billion people on the planet. That is one of the biggest things you can do. So again, this really not necessarily immediately obvious connection between girls' education and the impact on the world, in this case climate change. The fifth sort of reason why on our top 10 list is results in healthier and better educated children. There's lots of evidence that the higher level of mother's education, the more frequently her children are vaccinated, their nutrition levels are better, more often kids stay in school longer, do better on their exams, lots of evidence around that. Our sixth top 10 reason is reduction in HIV/AIDS and malaria. There's, again, lots, I know, it's impressive, I tell you, and that's how we came to our subtitle. There's lots of evidence to show, and in fact, colleagues often in the health community are calling girls' education the social vaccine to HIV/AIDS, because one can and should do health interventions. You can imagine what those would be for HIV/AIDS and malaria, bed nets, and lots of other things. But equally powerful is getting girls educated, because it appears that this is one of the ways that women better absorb health information, better comply and ensure and advocate for their kids to get the sort of treatment or materials they need, etc. The seventh is decrease child marriage. This one is also very, very obvious. If you just look at sort of levels of girls' education and overlay it with levels of child marriage, in countries where there are girls that have, hardly zero or just a couple years of education, they are 6 times more likely to get married as a child than with girls who've completed secondary education. And this is oftentimes because it can be various things. Girls themselves can be, once they get a high school education, can be more empowered to advocate with, or negotiate, I would say, within their family and communities that they don't want to get married necessarily. It can also be that girls, when they're educated, are more valuable outside of marriage because they can work, they can contribute to the family in that way, versus when they're not educated, they're more valuable to the family through being married and the economic benefits that brings to families. So the child marriage one is very, a lot of the child marriage advocates, one of their top sort of strategies that they're advocating for when they're advocating for reducing child marriage around the globe. There's organizations like Girls Not Brides, some of you may have heard of that. Getting girls educated is one of the most important pieces, in addition to working sort of across the community with sort of cultural norms, et cetera, and or economic offsetting. The eighth one in our list is that it leads to women's empowerment. There's some interesting studies that have come out. This is sort of across the board in voting, in community meetings, there's some interesting studies that the World Bank has done, some very good reports looking at domestic violence. And the higher levels of education, women are much more likely to exit abusive relationships, to not be in them from the beginning, etc. It's a hard area to measure, but there's certainly quite a bit of evidence on that. The ninth is around promoting political leadership. Again, higher levels of education, lots of interesting evidence. This is also more qualitative. It's not only leadership, if you think of like participation in national parliaments, etc., around the world, or high-level national elected positions, which many countries around the world do a lot better than the United States, by the way. But it's also participation in community decision-making, community, local sort of, collection of community decision-making, whether it's local councils, being part of the group of community members who decide what goes where or how budgets are allocated, etc. And that women, in some countries around the world, there's this study from India where you have quotas of, participation, there has to be a certain level of gender balance, not entirely balanced, but women have to participate in these types of forums. And they can be there and technically tick the box, yes, we have met our quota, and not say a word the entire time. And so really have very little impact, not feel deeply engaged. But when there's some interesting studies that show when you have women who have higher levels of education, they don't even have to have fully graduated secondary education necessarily, just more years of schooling. They're much more confident and seen as much more able to contribute, and hence often advocate in these types of political decision-making processes more frequently for money and support and resources to go to social services for kids, for communities, whether it's clean water or health or schools or whatever. So there's an interesting sort of ripple effect there too. And then the last one, linked to but slightly different from my example around climate change, the 10th reason we came up with in terms of our top 10 list of why girls' education is one of the world's best investment is some interesting evidence that talks about it reducing harm from natural disasters in particular. And there's lots of things you need to do to be prepared for natural disasters. We went through, I grew up on the West Coast, we would do earthquake drills, every Friday in school. That's one example of behavioral preparation. It could be infrastructure, it could be all sorts of things. But it appears that, here's a statistic I like. Deaths due to disasters, natural disasters, would fall 60% by 2050 if 70% of all the 20 to 39-year-old women completed lower secondary school. So it really is about community resilience and coping capacity and basically women's role in families and communities, which is really pivotal, which runs through all of this. One of the things that we also found out, so that's a lot of reasons why girls' education is a great investment for many different purposes, knock-on effects and ripple effects, in addition, of course, to it's their right. It's their right to get educated. Even if all of these things weren't related to girls' education, it would still be a worthy investment because it's their right and they deserve it, just like boys around the world. One of the things that we reflected upon when we were doing our analysis is that more so than we had previously thought, a lot of the benefits from girls' education comes from getting girls right the way through secondary school. Primary education is very important. It still has a lot of great returns, but it really is getting them through secondary school, which has got the maximum bang for your buck across these sort of 10 different reasons. So that's really how we sort of start with the book. Another thing that we talk about that I think is useful to share with all of you is, okay, if that's how great it is, how far do we have to travel? What are we doing? What's happening with girls' education around the world? And there has been, and we struggled with writing this section, which was really about the gaps left to fill, the progress to date, and the gaps left to fill. Because there has been a lot of progress in girls' education over the last 20 years, especially. That this has been an area where the world has done well. But it's just not done yet. It's not finished. So really, we talked about it as sort of a glass half full. Like we need to build on that progress. A lot of girls have entered into school over the course of the last couple decades with the Millennium Development Goals, etc. The average years of schooling of women around the world has doubled. So there is good progress, but there's sort of gaps in 6 areas. One area is just getting girls into school and making them right the way through secondary school. So there's about 62 million girls out of school around the world now. A lot of girls, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and Southwest Asia, these are the 2 regions of the world that most struggle with getting and keeping their girls into school. A lot of girls get in to primary school and they just don't quite make it to the end of primary and to finish secondary. Sub-Saharan Africa is a striking example where you have 75% of all the girls in Sub-Saharan Africa who get into school. So right there you're missing a quarter of them are not even entering. So that is a problem. But only 8% of them finish the last year of secondary school. So, you know, they just disappear along the way. So that is something we have to work on. It's related to many things, including sort of the second big gap, which is improving learning. The quality of education, and this is equally important for girls and boys. And we debated, you know, putting it in, because initially as we were doing the research and putting all our evidence up and trying to analyze it, people said, look, that's really important for girls and boys, so it's not just a girls' education thing. Then when you start to look at the numbers, you realize, well, actually, it is a girls' education thing, because improving quality would help the most number of girls get through school. There's 250 million kids around the world who don't know basic literacy and numeracy, and half of them have been in school for 4 years. They can't identify letters, they can't read words, they can't do basic sums. And if you can't do that at the very first couple of years of school, you're really going to have a hard time with your geography and your science and your history, right? If you can't read well, if you don't know basic math, it's very hard to progress. So actually, we would argue actually improving the quality of learning is absolutely something. It helps girls, it helps boys, absolutely, but it's absolutely one of the most important things you could do for girls' education. And well, it's a big piece of why those girls don't finish primary school. Not the only, but a big piece. The third sort of gap area is to recognize that there are, you know, a subset of countries where this is a big issue. A lot of countries, girls and boys are doing about the same, and they should improve their education writ large. Overall, some countries, boys are lagging much farther behind. The Caribbean, some parts of Latin America, this is the case. It's different reasons. It has more to do with the low quality of education writ large, and boys' ability to opt out and access the labor market more than girls. But really what we need to do today is sort of focus what we were calling on girls' education hotspots. And there's about, we go through it in the book, there's about 80 countries that in one way or another, again, they're sub-Saharan Africa, some across the Middle East and Southwest Asia are really where they're concentrated, are really sort of hotspot countries for girls' education. A fifth sort of big gap in area is to hone in and focus, and oftentimes these are where hotspot countries are, countries affected by humanitarian crisis and conflict. A third of all the kids who are out of school around the world are in places where there's humanitarian crises. Armed conflict, so the civil war in Syria is an example. Humanitarian crises due from natural disasters, you know, the terrible earthquake in Nepal recently, a little bit of last year, the health epidemics, Ebola, these types of things all get kids out of school. And then finally, really if you look across the data, the last sort of big gap is to look at, you know, you can look at different slices of where the gaps are, is really that the most marginalized girls who are the poorest, often members of the ethnic linguistic minority communities, are really farther behind. They're farther behind than their brothers, who are equally poor, also of an ethnic linguistic minority community, often in rural areas. And so really they are, you know, sort of bottom of the barrel and need the most help. So that's sort of very big picture. The good news is that there's a lot of things that can be done. There's a lot of programs out there that are trying different things, that are testing different approaches. There's a lot of, we call through evidence in the book, and with this I'll finish and open up to questions, to really see, you know, what are the solutions we can deploy against this problem, you know, for the very good reasons of we want to harness the best investment around girls' education that we can. And there's some really proven practices, and then there's some promising practices that seem to be working really well. Some of the proven practices work in a number of different countries, and promising practices should just continue to be expanded and evaluated and tried. And really there's sort of three things that need to be done. The first one, where there's good practices, is around you need to get figure out what works to get girls into school and to keep them there. And there's a host of things. One of the most successful has been to pay parents to send their kids to school. Have you guys heard of conditional cash transfers? Mm-hmm. So this is something that started in Latin America, has spread around the world. It's very good at enrollment, and if you require, people are playing with it in different ways. So people require basic attendance, our basic levels of exam pass rates. Some programs require girls not to be married until a certain age. And this is called conditional cash transfers, meaning the government gives cash to families conditional upon certain things being met. And has been very effective. Mexico is where this whole thing started, has increased 6th grade girls' completion by 15%, and their transition to secondary school by 14%, and that's sort of writ large. And of course, oftentimes different programs focus on very marginalized girls, the poorest, most marginalized, so there's different ways to play it. Other things that are important to do to help girls stay and finish school are really thinking about girls' health and the friendliness of the environment, such as latrines, clean water, reducing time and distance to school. There's a great program that I like that's worked really well in India where they give rural girls bicycles, and that's been great for enrolling and keeping them. Really ensuring that we have education sustained during emergencies, humanitarian crisis, which doesn't look like normal schooling, but it's possible to do, and that's been really important. Things like that. The second sort of big area is around what works to ensure quality learning. And they're hiring, much like here, hiring really good teachers, and or hiring teachers who are from the local community and training them up. There's often in girls' education, there's some evidence around women teachers closing the cultural gap. So even if they're not the best trained teacher formally with a formal credential, but they're female, and if you're working with really rural marginalized girls, they know the language, they know the culture, they know the parents and young women in that community, it reduces the cultural gap, and girls seem to do a lot better. But of course you need to train and support their development as a teacher. There's some interesting work, again, sticking with India, I think really trying to find strategies for classrooms to help the kids who are farthest behind. There's an NGO called Pratham who does this with a project called Read India, where they use community volunteers or different educators to tutor the kids who are the farthest behind on reading. And that does, it does a great job. Over 2 years they improve almost a half a standard deviation, which is a lot of improvement for education, and really gives those kids the boost they need. Another thing that often is important for the third thing, but is part of quality, is to think about not just literacy and math, but the range of other sort of competencies and skills that girls need to successfully navigate their life and navigate staying in school. And a lot of times people call these soft skills, but it's things like critical thinking and problem solving and interpersonal skills and negotiation skills. This particularly becomes incredibly important for girls as they hit adolescence and puberty. So the third real bucket of sort of what needs to be done and what works is to empower girls to lead, is what we're calling it. So really what we found is you can get girls to come to school and stay in school through a certain series of interventions, but those same interventions don't necessarily improve their quality or their learning. A conditional cash transfer doesn't necessarily improve teaching and learning experience. It's not designed to. The teacher training and these other range of activities do. But you could still have a case where girls are in school, they're staying, they're learning their academic knowledge, perhaps some critical thinking, and they're learning about how to be a very good wife, or how, which is not necessarily bad, but they're learning sort of cultural norms that maintain girls' vision of themselves and what's possible for their lives as sort of second-class citizens. There's been some interesting curriculum reviews in Jordan that really, you know, the scholar doing this talks about if you just look at the examples in the curriculum of what boys are supposed to be doing and learning, or girls are supposed to be doing and learning, girls are being prepared for the marriage market and boys are being prepared for the labor market. That's the sort of underlying message. And so it's really important if we really want girls, you know, to be fully educated, that they've got, you know, you have to think about gender equality, how that is taught, female role models, really diving in on sort of bridges to work. These types of things are all sort of promising practices that really seem to help with that piece. So with that, I think I'll stop there.
Well, thank you. There's so much. Let's. Well, I'll admit I have about 6 questions.
Yeah.
But I'd like to follow up right where you kind of ended about teaching, the teaching quality and the teachers, and go back to when you were doing your hands like this. That I taught in sub-Saharan Africa in the mid-70s in a school that had been founded by the Episcopal Church in a British colony. And they set up the school for only boys. And then when independence came, the government made it and so the girls could go to the school. And at the time that I was there, they were just bringing the girls in. They were in the 8th and 9th grades. And
year by year.
Year by year, yeah. They were bringing them in. But when I arrived at that school as an American volunteer teacher of chemistry and math, the classroom was empty of a teacher. The students were sent there with their textbook and told that they were supposed to learn the subject by reading the textbook, but there was no teacher. And so I'm thinking about this graph of the numbers of students and the numbers of teachers. Our daughter was born while we lived there, and when she graduated from college, as a kind of graduation celebration, we took her back to see where she'd been born, and I met the headmaster at the school, and he tried to recruit her to be the math and science teacher because the classroom
still had no teacher.
Well, I don't know whether it had been in those 20 years, but at that point, the classroom was empty again. Well, that's a lot of context to say when I think about how there can possibly be enough teachers to take care of this huge number, the 62 million girls. Where are those teachers and what kind of investment would it really take to be able to educate 62 million people?
Yeah, and it's not just the 62 million girls who are out of school, it's also the girls who are enrolled and sitting in the classroom with no teacher too, and the boys. So it's there is a big teacher gap. Sub-Saharan Africa alone needs millions and millions of teachers just to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, which are sort of the UN's big goals for the next 15 years, and there's an education goal around quality lifelong learning. And it's a huge problem. There is a high-level commission that is looking at this very question, not just teachers, but on how to finance it and what do we have to do to get to that goal. It's called the Commission on Financing Education Opportunity. And I think, they haven't come out with their report, so I could be wrong, but I think part of what they're going to look at, and it would certainly be my assessment too, is that there's really no way to train high-quality male and female teachers, say, across sub-Saharan Africa that we need in the next 5 years. it's just the volumes are so big. In an ideal world, you would have great teacher training institutes, you would have a very strong pipeline. This is ideal world of young people going into the teaching profession. You would have strong working ministries of education who would deploy them appropriately and pay them well and keep them in the profession, right? All of these are barriers actually to teaching. A lot of times teachers don't show up because they are given another job by the local government. They have to go monitor polling places. They have to go do this because they're often one of the more educated people in their community. They have like all these responsibilities. Or sometimes teachers don't show up because they are paid so poorly. They need to go farm. They need to go. They need another job to just feed their kids and send their own kids to school. So, sometimes teachers shouldn't be teachers and they don't care. That's my experience is that's not usually the case. The vast majority do care, are trying to do the right thing, but they're not well supported. So. This is sort of the question of this is one of the big questions of our day in terms of global education. And people are looking at a lot of different things. I personally think we're going to have to be creative about how do we possibly elevate the role of the teacher and bring in community expertise that can unburden teachers and fulfill those roles, so really use teachers and their professional expertise to the highest degree and free them of some of the administrative stuff that they have to do that maybe somebody else who's not a teacher could come in and do. If you think of a teacher's daily schedule, and this is sort of in most cases around the world certainly true, my kids' school here in Washington, D.C., I mean, not only do they have to teach and prepare lessons and instruct, they have to follow up with the poor behavior kids. They have to fill out reams of administrative paperwork. They're responsible for something else in the school that has to do with management. And they have to meet with parents. I mean, it's a very difficult task. And the public health community in Africa did this a little while ago, where they really elevated the role of doctors and they brought in community health workers to do things that you didn't necessarily have to bother doctors with, administering vaccines, etc. And that really helped with the shortage of doctors. So we might have to seriously get creative and think about that, and really think about elevating teachers and thinking about their expertise and how they can be maximally supported to have the greatest impact.
Well, I'm glad you're working on it. What other question you want to follow up on? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sharon Kotak. Thank you for this presentation. To follow up on your question, has the United States thought about really trying to beef up our Peace Corps so that we can send a lot of Peace Corps volunteers out as teachers? Mm-hmm. And I know I don't want to. I know that the optimum solution is they have teachers from the countries or the regions where they are, but I mean this could be a short-term solution.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I get asked that not necessarily just Peace Corps, but other should we send troves of volunteer teachers over? I think that's always a good thing to do. As I look at the numbers and I look at what a volunteer teacher from another country can bring, like folks in the Peace Corps, it's not the solution to this problem for a number of reasons. Peace Corps volunteers. And by the way, the U.S. government, through First Lady Michelle Obama, has really started a new initiative to have sort of a stream within the Peace Corps to work on girls' education. So actually, they are thinking like you, and thinking, how can we tap Peace Corps volunteers to really focus on girls on education issues? Because of course, Peace Corps volunteers can focus on any number of issues in the community. So that's a very good thing. But the Peace Corps experience, probably the most benefit is to the volunteer, is to the young American who's going out and learning about a new culture. It's just an incredible experience. It's a great thing to do. It's great for connection. Most of the people I've ever hired in my life, because I've worked on global education, are former Peace Corps volunteers. So I'm a huge supporter of the Peace Corps. But they're not the solution to the teaching gap. They don't speak the language, they don't know the culture, they don't know the curriculum, they're not trained as teachers. Like, you can go on and on. They can be very helpful in helping, I think, do community projects, in helping perhaps training of teachers, right? Going and volunteering in the Teacher Training Institute that is always low resource, doesn't have a lot of materials, that, that will be great, particularly if there's English is a medium of instruction. In the non-Anglophone countries, it's a little more difficult. Oftentimes you'll have people who teach English. That's very useful, teaching English, and that's something people want around the world. So there's a role, but it's not going to be unfortunately, our solution to the teacher gap.
Hi, I'm Beverly Nyberg, and I work with the Peace Corps. And am somewhat involved in the Let Girls Learn project, along with the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief and the Dreams initiative, which is for trying to keep adolescent girls and young women HIV-free. And one of the strategies, of course, is to keep them in school, because of the research on that. So that's just to put it out there that, yes, I agree with all that you're saying, and that we do have specific programs for actually trying to beef up our teaching English as a second language program, as well as, in the Let Girls Learn, a lot of it has to do with also gender equity initiative as well. But okay, that's on the side. But my question for you is more on the role of technology and the possibility of using technology, particularly to assist in reading and math for just the basics. And have you seen any promising practice or real strong evidence around that?
I'm so glad you asked that question. My new project that we're working on a lot with colleagues at the Center for Universal Education is really trying to look at sort of new models of education. So looking towards the future. How should education delivery be changed? How can we elevate the role of the teacher, be more efficient, get better outcomes, have better connection with the community? What is future directions, and we're doing a major scan of the globe of education innovations, or effective practices, I always call them, because sometimes they're not so new, these innovations, but they're just applied of what we know for many decades. But anyways, so we have a scan all around the globe, and we've been a big chunk of it has been looking at technology, not only, and I think there's a lot of, and certainly with the teachers I've talked to, and people who work, the teacher trainers I've talked to, there's a lot of scope for helping, again, elevate the role of the teacher and unburden all the stuff they have to do by putting effective, appropriate technology in teachers' hands that can help them do things that they don't necessarily have to, no reason they should each individually figure out on their own. Yeah. How to teach fractions in math. It's a real pain in the butt to try to figure out how to teach fractions to, elementary school students. Yeah. And guess what? It's much, each math teacher around the globe does not have to reinvent how to teach fractions. There could be a few different ways, and they could draw down on it, figure out what works for them. That would make their lives much better. Certainly, the whole move, there's an organization called World Reader who's really looking at e-readers and getting reading materials not through sort of the cumbersome print the book, have the trucks distribute them, but get e-readers in kids' hands and finding ways to upload. You don't even have to be on the internet to use kids' time to have access to books and literature. That's something that kids don't have a lot of access to in a lot of these countries, and they're doing a lot of partnerships with local language publications. So yeah, and it turns out that girls actually are 6 times more likely to read on the e-readers than boys, in part because they might not feel comfortable going to libraries, or they're able to do it more privately, more quietly, in different spaces. So yeah, that's another example of technology. Then there's a whole bunch of stuff making I think, education management more efficient, which is kind of back office things,
Right.
where whether it's collecting data so a teacher doesn't have to sit there manually and give it to somebody, if you could do that through a mobile phone, or it just makes things easier and more efficient, and hopefully with the goal of increasing and elevating teachers' time and ability to spend instructing kids. Yeah, so I think there's a range of promising approaches.
And Khan Academy, like for instance, have
Yeah.
you, are there, I'm sure
Yeah,
there are
there's a
others
lot
like
of
that.
different technology platforms out there that provide content. Khan Academy is one, and it's used in many different ways around the world,
Yeah.
not always as it's intended. So for example,
Mhm.
one of the best universities in Ghana, it's called Ashesi University, uses Khan Academy for its first year entrants to get them up to speed on some core subjects. So that shows you the sort of level of
Yeah.
gaps between developed country and developing country learning levels. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Sue Klein. I'm the Education Equity Director at the Feminist Majority Foundation. And before that, I worked in the U.S. Department of Education in the research offices. And
Great.
one of the things that we've done is we've published 2 handbooks for achieving gender equity through education, which synthesized a lot of the research. So, it's great to hear your presentation, but I still have questions, of course. One of the things you didn't mention was the whole issue of whether or not it was a good strategy in various countries to have gender equitable co-education versus the sex segregated education, where often we see that the girls' education facilities and provisions are less well-resourced than boys.
Yeah, that's a tough question, and often it gets to the question of like boarding schools too. Is that what you're also alluding to? Sort of secondary education, girls, which is where the biggest problem is at the moment, is getting girls to secondary education. From our look, I think in certain contexts it could be very good. In certain contexts,
What could be very good?
sex segregated education. Girls in one school, boys in another, or girls in the first shift, boys in the second shift. In certain contexts, that's all that exists. That's how education is done for those cultural reasons. But there isn't sort of any overwhelming evidence, at least across the developing world, that things like introducing sex-segregated girls' boarding schools for high school, for example, is that much better. In part, it's for what you mentioned, that there's safety issues. They're more vulnerable to harassment and exploitation. If you look at Nigeria, northern Nigeria, girls get kidnapped. They can be, but across the board, it's not sort of a panacea answer. Did you have some other evidence in mind?
Our view is that it's much better to have gender equitable co-education to
If you're able to do it in the
stereotypes.
cultural context, I think that's usually a good way to go.
And in the U.S., of course, we have Title IX, which is very supportive, especially with the new Department of Education guidelines for co-educational classes and decreasing sex stereotypes. One of your last points got a little bit at decreasing sex stereotypes and changing cultural norms. Have you found that that's being done well in certain cases?
I'll give you some. It's a really good question because it's a hard thing to do, and you would probably know a lot more about the U.S. education system, so you could chime in on what works in the U.S. But I'll give you an example of a place where it's working quite well, a program that we reviewed. There's a group called the Study Hall Foundation out of India, run by a woman named Urvashi Sani, who's a colleague, and she basically uses government types of facilities at different hours, or if it's not being used. She's an NGO. She uses the same teaching pool that the government would do. She uses the government curriculum, but she does have girls' school. She has a girls' school, and then she does have mixed school and the boys' school. It really depends on the cultural environment, what is acceptable in that particular community. But in the girls' program, girls' education program, she does everything sort of standard, more or less, except she introduces a day a week. If you talk to her in an academic context, she'll say it's gender dynamics. She introduces a new curriculum called gender dynamics. That's not what they call it. Actually, in the community, it's called reflections, critical dialogues. I don't know, so, something innocuous. But basically, for one additional period of study a week, and she talks about gender dynamics. And it's a whole process of the girls reflecting on themselves as girls and the society they're in. And these are girls from the poor, sort of the poorest communities who face huge hurdles, extremely high rates of high rates of child marriage and domestic violence. So they have a lot to reflect upon. But it's been amazing that she really attributes that, and then to the success of the program. So these girls have gone on, they complete at much higher rates than national average in India. A high percentage of them go on to higher education, which is very rare for particularly their group, but compared to the national average in India. A number of them have gotten scholarships to the US. So it's an incredible process, actually, and it changes also the way teachers teach at the end of the day, because they are learning, they're facilitating these critical dialogues. So it really changes in ethos. So that's a great example.
Does she also do this in co-ed groups for boys too?
Yeah, I bet she probably does.
Good.
Maybe we have time for one more question. Is there, or a comment, or is there anyone else? If not, go for it.
Okay, I just, sorry for asking a second question, but I'm curious, is the United States and is the United Nations, like UNHCR, are they devoting enough attention to education of refugees and displaced persons?
No.
Okay.
It was easy. And it's not for the people inside the UN necessarily, in terms of the, UNHCR and the humanitarian actors, who are responsible for the, helping and supporting in collaboration with the governments on the ground. I'll take the Syrian refugee crisis, for example. Education is funded, less than 2% of humanitarian aid goes to education. For, you could say, obvious reasons: health, water, safety, sanitation. But the truth is that, most refugee crises last for a very long time. The average length of stay, and this was a statistic that was out several years ago, but I haven't seen a more updated one. What do you guys think the average length of stay in a refugee camp is, or is it?
6 years.
17. 17. So if you don't provide education, what are you doing?
Right.
And so it's really a fundamental shift that needs to happen in the whole humanitarian system. So it's not that UNHCR is bad. They would like to support education more if they had more funding from groups like the US government and other people who fund them, right? But it's a question of priorities and funding.
Well, thank you. We've been talking with Rebecca Winthrop, and you can learn even more about what she said from her book. So
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing with us, and thanks to the Rumi Forum for sponsoring this and encouraging this conversation. All right,
Thank
thank you.